Nehemiah 6 verse 1 reveals that the work on the walls is nearing completion. The gaps in the walls had been repaired, and all that was left was to put the large doors in place at the various gates of the city. And then the work would be complete. But the opposition still trying to stop him. And in verse 2 they send a message saying that they want to have a meeting with Nehemiah. On the face of it, that seems quite innocent enough. Let's have a meeting about everything that's going on. But at the end of verse 2, Nehemiah knows these men. He knows what they're like. He knows that the intentions of them is to slow down the work and to harm him and the other people of Judah. So in verse 3, Nehemiah replies to them saying that he's doing an important work and he can't come down from the walls to have a meeting. He says quite simply, why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? His answer was that we've got work to do. And the work shouldn't stop for a discussion. His focus was all on getting that work done. That's all that mattered to him. And his response was pretty simple. What do we need to talk about? I'm doing God's work. That's all that matters. We shouldn't be stopping this work for discussions and meetings. But the men were very persistent. 4 times they sent the same proposal to Nehemiah, but each time he gave the same reply. We don't need to have a meeting. We're doing an important work. Now, to just think about this response from a few points of view. One way to stop the work that Nehemiah was doing for God was to talk it to death. Always talk about it, but actually never do anything about it. Always have meetings about what should be done and what they're going to do, but never actually do it. And what often happens at meetings like that is that the issue of our work is talked about, but no solution is determined. Perhaps a bit like some of the government discussions they have at the moment over various things, like the post office problems. They seem to go on and on and on and on, and still haven't really finished and sorted out. And that's just what Nehemiah knew would happen. They would probably say to him, who's given you permission to do this work? And then, have you applied for planning permission for these walls? Well, I don't know whether they have planning permission in that days, but are you using the right type of stone? Have you got enough men to do the job? And what about the gates that you're doing? Is there enough wood to build it? Etc., etc. All that Nehemiah says is that we just need to get on with it, do the work. We're not going to stop to have meetings about it. His focus was straight down the line. Do the work that God had asked of him. Since Nehemiah was focused and unwilling to stop the work for meetings, they pressed him even further. And in verses 5 to 7, they write an open letter to him. This means that this is a letter that's going to be circulated for everyone, so that everyone can read it, not a private message. And this open letter said, it's reported and we have confirmation that you are planning a rebellion and are going to make yourself king. You even have prophets prepared to proclaim you King of Judah when the walls are finished. We are going to send this back to the king of Persia, who actually ruled that part of the world. So you need to meet with us, because this is what we're going to tell people. But Nehemiah's response was a very simple message. These are all lies. You're making them up. There's no truth to these rumours you're spreading. Just lies. And then Nehemiah does as he has been doing all the way through. He prays for strength. He's going to depend on God through prayer, not give in to the fears of what the opposition's trying to do against him. What Sanballat is wanting to do is stop the work by dragging Nehemiah's name through the mud. And in doing so, his hope is that Nehemiah will stop the work, have these meetings, or be frightened of what may happen if certain people read the letter. But he doesn't cave into all this, Nehemiah. He just continues to do the work. He simply declares that they are, as I say, vicious lies, and he prays to the Lord for strength. All the way through this book so far, Nehemiah has prayed. Every step of the way. He trusted in the Lord to handle the situation. And he continues to carry on to complete the work. And we must never stop doing God's work because of our fears. We can't stop something that God's asked us to do simply because of what people say about us. Rather than stopping any opposition that we may have, we'll strengthen our hands even more to do the work that God has given us to do. There is a determination on Nehemiah's part that we must have for ourselves for the work that God has for us. Your opposition can come from unexpected places at times, just as it did with Nehemiah. But we should never lose heart when we're carrying out God's work. Don't give up. God will strengthen us as we do his will. And then there is one more attempt, finally, to stop the work on the walls. Nehemiah meets with the prophet Shemaiah, and the prophet tells Nehemiah he must hide himself in the temple because his enemies are coming to kill him at night. This certainly sounds plausible, that these enemies are going to come at night and try and kill him and end this work. But his response again is, should a man like me run away or go into the temple to save my life, I won't go. Nehemiah continues to show an unwavering commitment to the work. Even when he's told his life may be threatened, he continues to pray, and eventually the work is completed. With Nehemiah as this leader, focused down the line, and his commitment to God, the people finally succeed in completing the rebuilding of the city walls and putting the gates in place in 52 days. Now, over the past few weeks, you might have thought that maybe years have gone by through all this. It seems to go on and go on, doesn't it? But in fact, it's been a really intense 2-month period since Nehemiah set out from God's call to actually completing this work. You can see what Nehemiah and his work of success showed. The nations around them were afraid because they realized that this work had been accomplished with God's help. God was the reason for the success. God was why they could overcome all the obstacles. God was with them all the way. And we too, at any time, should focus on the goal and focus on the fact that God will walk with us all the way to the finish line. Now, over these past few weeks, as we've been looking at Nehemiah, we've heard a great deal about the walls of Jerusalem. Eventually, as I say, they were built to protect the city now, just as the walls around York, for example, were built by the Romans to protect the city there against various enemies. Walls are something we see everywhere, aren't they? You go up into the Dale, well, anywhere really, you see dry stone walls built by the farmers to map out their fields, keep their sheep or cattle in. Walls can teach us a great deal. I say that because there are two walls in particular that I personally will always remember, because they taught me a lot about the human race. The first one was one outside of Block 11 in Auschwitz concentration camp. The actual wall itself had been pulled down at the end of the Second World War, and this was a one that had been built to illustrate what had happened. And thousands of people were executed during the Second World War against this wall. A lot of those people had done nothing wrong. Some were executed simply because they weren't up to the standards of the Nazi masters. Russian prisoners of war were executed there. Jews who were so worn out they could no longer work for the Nazis. Instead, the easiest way was just line them up and shoot them. And when I stood there looking at that wall, it helped me to realise the actual depths of evil that humanity can descend to. But then there's another wall that I'll never forget, and that's called the Wailing or Western Wall in the city of Jerusalem. It's a place of prayer and pilgrimage, and a place that is sacred to the Jewish people now. It's the only part of the wall that surrounded the temple of Solomon that was built on top of it. And to stand there and watch traditional Jews bowing and weeping in some cases in front of that wall, or writing out prayers on a piece of paper and placing them in the cracks in the wall, it's a very moving experience. We have the opportunity to write a prayer ourselves and place it in a crack in the wall. And all these prayers are collected twice a year, and then they're buried in the Jewish cemetery on top of the Mount of Olives. That's a place from which Jesus ascended into heaven. And it's also the place where he went and spent the night in prayer to his Father. So, from seeing the depths of evil that mankind can descend to, I've also seen the heights by which the human spirit can rise to meet with God. And the book of Nehemiah shows us that the evil that had destroyed the promised land and the temple, representing the very presence of God, was the very thing which God used to speak to Nehemiah, a man who constantly prayed to him and overcame all obstacles in his way in order to carry out his will and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And from all this, I think we can learn that when God calls us to do something, we should do as Nehemiah did. Pray, focus on that task in hand, and do not be sidetracked by anyone, and carry out the work in the strength that God gives you to do it. Amen.